The cold morning air bit into Samuel's skin as he tightened his threadbare jacket around himself. The janitor had worked in the towering glass skyscraper for nearly a decade, yet he was invisible to the people who walked its halls. He swept the floors, scrubbed the bathrooms, and emptied the trash. His presence acknowledged only when something needed to be cleaned, but that was fine. He never complained. Today, however, was different. As Samuel pushed his mop across the marble floor of the lobby, a pair of expensive leather shoes clicked against the polished surface, stopping just inches away from his bucket. He looked up, only to meet the cold, calculating gaze of Mr. Harrison Grant, the CEO of the company. The man was a billionaire, known for his ruthless business tactics and even harsher treatment of those he deemed beneath him. Samuel felt a lump in his throat. He had always made sure to stay out of the boss's way. But before he could step aside, Mr. Grant's voice sliced through the quiet morning. "You missed a spot," the CEO said, pointing to a nearly invisible stain on the floor. Samuel nodded quickly and bent down to scrub the spot with a rag. But Mr. Grant wasn't done. "I don't know why we even pay you," he muttered, shaking his head. "You're slow, inefficient, and—" He paused, eyeing Samuel's worn-out clothes. "Completely unpresentable. You make this place look cheap." A few employees had started to gather nearby, their eyes darting between their powerful boss and the aging janitor. Some whispered to each other, but none dared to intervene. Samuel swallowed hard and kept his head down. He had learned long ago that answering back would only make things worse. Mr. Grant let out a frustrated sigh. "You should be grateful you even have a job. People like you are replaceable." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Samuel standing there. Humiliation burning in his chest. The incident spread through the office like wildfire. Some laughed, others shook their heads, but no one stood up for the janitor. Samuel, as always, kept working, acting as though nothing had happened. But life has a strange way of turning the tables. Just days later, Mr. Grant found himself in a situation he never expected, one that would change his perspective forever. Samuel didn't let the humiliation break him, but the sting of those words lingered. He had spent years working tirelessly, doing the kind of job most people ignored, just to put food on the table. He had never asked for much, just the dignity of honest work. But dignity wasn't something men like Harrison Grant gave freely. After that morning, the whispers around the office grew louder. Some employees threw sympathetic glances at Samuel, but none dared to voice their opinions. No one wanted to be the next target of the boss's wrath. To them, he was just a janitor, someone who existed in the background, unnoticed until necessary. Meanwhile, Mr. Grant carried on with his usual arrogance. His life was one of power and luxury, untouched by the struggles of ordinary people. He believed that wealth was a result of hard work and intelligence, and that those at the bottom simply weren't trying hard enough. The idea that a janitor could be anything but a failure never even crossed his mind. But then, things started to change. One morning, as Mr. Grant entered his office, he was met with unexpected news. A major investor had pulled out of a multi-million-dollar deal, citing concerns about the company's management. Mr. Grant brushed it off as a minor setback. After all, his company had survived worse. But over the next few days, more problems piled up. Contracts were delayed, stocks wavered, and rumors of instability began spreading among the board members. Then came the lawsuit. A former employee had filed a case against the company, accusing Mr. Grant of unethical business practices. It wasn't the first time someone had made such claims, but this time, the media caught wind of it. The news spread like wildfire, and soon, Investors were reconsidering their involvement with the company. The pressure mounted, and for the first time in years, Mr. Grant felt something unfamiliar: fear. At first, he refused to acknowledge the crisis. He barked orders at his assistants, fired a few scapegoats, and tried to regain control, but nothing worked. The empire he had built, brick by brick, was showing cracks, and no amount of power or money could stop it. One evening, after a particularly disastrous board meeting, Mr. Grant stormed out of the building. His driver wasn't there, so he decided to walk. He needed air. The streets were cold, and as he passed by the alleys and small shops he usually ignored, something caught his eye. A small soup kitchen stood at the corner, its warm glow spilling onto the sidewalk. Curious, he stepped closer and peeked inside. The sight made him freeze. Samuel was there. The janitor, the same man he had humiliated just days ago, was serving food to the homeless. He moved with a quiet grace, handing out meals, offering warm smiles, and speaking to people as if they mattered. There was no bitterness in his eyes, no resentment, only kindness. Mr. Grant watched in silence as Samuel greeted an elderly man, carefully placing a plate in front of him. The old man clasped Samuel's hand, gratitude evident in his tired eyes. For the first time in a long while, something stirred in Mr. Grant's chest. He stepped back, his mind racing. How could a man with so little still give so much? He had spent his entire life chasing power, convinced that money was the only thing that mattered. But standing there, outside that small soup kitchen, he suddenly felt empty. He turned and walked away, but the image of Samuel's quiet kindness stayed with him. That night, Mr. Grant barely slept. His mind replayed the moments over and over at the downfall of his empire, the people who had abandoned him, and the janitor who had no reason to care for others, yet still did. And then, just as exhaustion pulled him into restless sleep, a thought struck him. Maybe he had been wrong all along. Maybe the real strength wasn't in power or wealth, but in the way people chose to treat one another. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to change. The next morning, Mr. Grant arrived at the office unusually early. The weight of the previous night's thoughts still lingered, making his steps slower, his usual confidence shaken. He looked around at the massive, pristine building he had built, once a symbol of his power, now a reminder of how fragile it all was. For the first time in years, he noticed things he had long ignored. The exhausted employees who walked in with slumped shoulders, the nervous glances exchanged in the hallways, the silent fear of being the next target of his temper. And then there was Samuel, mopping the floors, just as he did every morning, as if nothing had ever happened. Mr. Grant hesitated. His instinct told him to walk past, to bury himself in his office, and pretend everything was fine. But he knew deep down that pretending had only made things worse. So, instead, he did something he had never done before. He stopped. Samuel looked up, startled, when he saw the CEO standing before him. Mr. Grant cleared his throat, suddenly unsure of what to say. Apologies weren't something he was used to. I owe you an apology, he finally said, his voice quieter than usual. Samuel blinked, clearly surprised. It wasn't every day that a billionaire humbled himself before a janitor. But instead of gloating, Samuel simply nodded, waiting for him to continue. I was wrong about you, Mr. Grant admitted. About a lot of things. He let out a breath. I thought power and money were everything. But last night, I saw you. I saw what you do for others. Even when you have so little yourself. Samuel still didn't speak, but there was something different in his gaze now. He wasn't just looking at a boss. He was looking at a man who, for the first time, was trying to understand. Mr. Grant took another breath. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away, but I want to change. I need to." He paused. "And I think I need your help." A silence stretched between them before Samuel finally spoke. "Change isn't about words, sir," he said simply. "It's about what you do next." And with that, he went back to his work, leaving Mr. Grant standing there, thinking. Over the next few weeks, something remarkable happened. Mr. Grant began making real changes, not just in the company, but in himself. He started treating his employees with respect, actually listening to their concerns. He invested in better working conditions, ensuring that even the lowest paid workers felt valued. And one evening, when his company finally stabilized after weeks of crisis, he made his most unexpected decision yet. He walked back into the soup kitchen where he had first seen Samuel. Only this time, he wasn't just watching. He rolled up his sleeves, picked up a ladle, and started serving food alongside the janitor he had once humiliated. At first, people whispered. Some couldn't believe it. Others thought it was just for show. But Samuel, he simply handed Mr. Grant a tray and said, "Welcome." And for the first time in his life, Harrison Grant felt something he had never felt before. True fulfillment. Not from power, not from money, but from finally understanding what it meant to be human. And so, in the end, the janitor who was once humiliated became the man who taught a millionaire the most valuable lesson of all. As Mr. Grant continued volunteering at the soup kitchen, something unexpected happened. He changed, not just in small ways, but in ways that truly mattered. The sharp edges of his personality softened. He listened more, not just to his employees, but to people he had never noticed before. The security guards, the receptionists, the delivery workers. He greeted them now, asked about their families, and meant it. At first, many people doubted him. His employees watched from a distance, skeptical that a man like Harrison Grant could ever truly change. But actions speak louder than words. He implemented policies that ensured fair wages, improved working conditions, and even started funding community outreach programs. He began hiring people who needed a second chance, single parents, struggling veterans, and even those who had been homeless, just like the ones he had served meals to at the kitchen. One evening, after another long day at the company, Mr. Grant found himself standing outside the soup kitchen once again, but this time, he wasn't alone. His employees were with him, managers, assistants, even board members. All of them had come to volunteer. At first, they had joined out of curiosity, but soon they found themselves drawn in by something deeper. As Mr. Grant handed a bowl of soup to an elderly man, he looked over at Samuel, who was watching him with the same quiet, knowing expression. There was no smugness, no "I told you so" in his eyes, just understanding. Mr. Grant let out a breath and gave a small, tired smile. "I think I get it now," he said. Samuel nodded. "Good," he replied. "Now don't stop." And he didn't. Months passed, and the once feared CEO became a name people spoke of with admiration rather than fear. His company flourished, not just financially, but as a place where people wanted to work. He had once believed that kindness was a weakness, but he had learned that it was, in fact, the greatest strength of all. One day, as he was leaving the office, he spotted Samuel in the lobby, mopping the floors just as he always had. Mr. Grant hesitated before walking over. "You've worked here a long time," he said. "Too long to still be doing this." Samuel raised an eyebrow. "It's honest work." Mr. Grant smiled. "That it is. But I think it's time for something new." He reached into his pocket and handed Samuel an envelope. A promotion. I'd like you to oversee our community outreach programs. You already know more about helping people than I ever did. Samuel stared at the envelope for a long moment before finally looking up. You sure about this? Mr. Grant grinned. I've never been more sure of anything. For the first time, Samuel smiled back. And just like that, the janitor who was once humiliated became the man who helped a millionaire rewrite his legacy. Not with wealth or power, but with kindness, respect, and a second chance.